This is the Beyond the Delusions interview with Indy Johar for the Salon, an initiative of the Enlightened Enterprise Academy. People in organizations of all types, in all parts of the world, increasingly recognize the 21st century calls for far more enlightened ways of thinking and getting things done. Old and outdated ideas are resulting in more frequent and larger scale crises. The old ideas are no match for the scale and complexity of the challenges we face today. Enlightened enterprise approaches are needed if we're to ensure our prosperity and well-being, and that of generations yet unborn. Greed and ruthless exploitation must give way to compassion, stewardship, trust, and cooperation. If you agree, join us, get involved. Together we can be an effective force for good in a world that desperately needs fresh thinking and new ideas. The Salon from the Enlightened Enterprise Academy is where you can hear that fresh thinking and new ideas. We bring together some of the world's leading thinkers for interviews and dialogues with our members, members of our faculty, and subscribers to the Salon. The first series of interviews for the Salon is called Inflection. We're at an inflection point in human history. In our past, pivotal moments have irrevocably reshaped our societies and propelled us forward. The First Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution that followed were such moments. The changes we're now living through will come to be recognized as another inflection point. If we make the right decisions, we can achieve another leap of progress in the human story. But the nature of the challenges we face mean the future of humanity is also threatened if we make the wrong decisions. In this context, our ability to make the right choices has never been more important. My name is Paul Barnett, CEO of the Enlightened Enterprise Academy, and today I'm interviewing Indy Johar. Indy is an award-winning architect and co-founder of Dark Matters Labs. He's also a founding director of Open Systems Lab and has founded several other open source initiatives. Among the other roles detailed in his full biography, you'll see that Indy is a non-exec director of Blocks Hub, the Nordic hub for sustainable urbanization. He's on the advisory board of the Futures Observatory and is part of the committee for the London Festival of Architecture. He's also a fellow of the London Interdisciplinary School. Indy was awarded the London Design Medal for Innovation and an MBE for services to architecture. I'm going to dive straight into the interview now. So welcome, Indy. And the title for the interview that we're doing today is Beyond the Delusions. You actually used that expression in a talk you gave previously, and I thought it was an interesting title for this discussion today. You say that we're deluding ourselves if we're thinking that we're not on a pathway to mutually assured destruction. Maybe you could start by just explaining what you mean by that.
Yes, firstly, delighted to be here, Paul. Thank you for everything that you're doing in the space. So let me start by just thanking you. I think with regards to delusions, what I'm referring to is the gap that exists between the science and our political frames of addressing the science. And I don't just mean science as in, yes, obviously climate breakdown science, but also social tipping points, also all sorts of other planetary limits that we're hitting that we're not able to find, we're not able to respond to adequately. And I also worry that actually some of the even responses and strategies that we've got are deluded. Even the narratives that we're telling ourselves are deluded as to the kind of actualities of what's being implied and the shadow of those realities. And that's preventing, and there's also a delusion, I think, that actually somehow we can go through the societal bottlenecking without achieving self-termination, without achieving a cascading effect of war that actually nobody comes out of, a pathway to mutually assured destruction. Delusions for me are every level, whether it's unfortunately, and a new government coming in saying we're going to build 1.5 million homes and not actually recognizing there isn't the carbon budgets available. So sure, they can build 1.5 billion homes. The question really is, how do you build a new, and I don't mean economy just in the financial terms, an environmental infrastructure for 1.5 million homes in these constraints that we're operating in? It means that we are struggling to have honest conversations. One of the key questions is, how do we stop having more delusional conversations to start to embrace actually some of the realities that we're facing, and then not to be self-terminated into those realities, not to be defeatist in those, but to talk about the civilizational transformations that are necessary and possible, and maybe uniquely possible, that are available to us.
Great. So it's not the delusion, it's the delusions, plural. And in the first half of this interview, I think it'd be interesting if we try to sort of unpack and understand what some of those delusions are. We'll cover them sort of fairly briefly, but then we'll spend the bulk of this interview looking at how do we start to address some of those problems. But I want to begin by looking at the issues using the typical management approach, the PESTEL framework as it's known. So we're looking at it through the lenses of political, economic, social, technical, legal, and environmental. You recognize that everything's, to use a word that you use frequently, entangled. So we don't solve each of these problems separately. We're only going to solve them if we actually try to address them all in a synchronized way, I think what you would agree, yeah? So first of all, just let's look at the issues, starting with environmental, which you started to touch on, and then we'll go through the other areas.
There's probably a list longer than my arm, but
yeah.
the major ones I would say is one, climate breakdown. And I think it's important to use the word climate breakdown, which is the loss of predictable weather. So one is the energification of the weather of our climate, which is the increase in energy, which manifests, yes, in temperature, but also manifests in more violent storms, more violent other weather conditions. So it's the violence of our weather conditions. And then it's also the energification of our climate itself, which obviously results in temperature. And many of you will know, or hopefully many of you will know, that the challenge for humanity is that actually is the combination of wet bulb temperatures, where you have 100% humidity and temperature. And once you get to those environments, humans just don't survive. And what we're seeing is actually critical points starting to be achieved in wet bulb temperatures. And so there's, on one sense, there's that. There's the other sense, and just to give you an idea, that between 1.7 to 1.9 degrees, I'm going to move from climate to its effects. You lose one of the global food baskets. So what you have is climate vulnerability and breakdown starting to affect our food systems. Now, we lose one of our food baskets in 2008, when we had actually a series of agricultural food pricing events around the world. You saw riots happen literally around the world. So that, many attribute those pressures driving the Arab Spring and other things as being tipping point pressures. So what you have is a situation where, as our food systems become more fragile, you start to effectively come into crisis with a series of other events in terms of actually pricing of food systems becomes significantly larger, and you start to effectively get to a point where not only does our pricing start to happen, inequality of food systems, we've already seen nutritious decline. So you have this food effect. Now, next is cooling. Let's just keep going on cooling. If urban temperatures are 8 degrees warmer, what you have is a situation where the cooling load of cities becomes significantly larger. So this puts energy demands on cities and places, energy demands to which we currently don't have not even the replacement energy. We're not even actually replacing our baseload hydrocarbon energy. What we're largely doing is replacing sort of the new demand with renewables. So we've got an increase, and what we're seeing between, I think, 2000 and 2020 onwards is actually energy demand start to increase globally. So the data centers, I would say, environmental conditions, but also sort of machine learning capabilities, all of these things, and reindustrialization of the global north is increasing effectively energy demand. Now, that has a double impact. One, in terms of actually the environment will drive that, but also the energy demand means that our material base has to be materially massively increased. So, and again, I think people like Nate Higgins and Ed Conway talk about this. As we start to have climate breakdown, we lose theoretical predictability. And the loss of predictability means that we lose capital markets. Capital markets are largely a function of some theory of insurance. So what we're seeing is the narrowing of the insurance domain. And in the process of narrowing of the insurance domains, we're starting to have assets operating without insurance landscapes. And what that means is you can't get a mortgage, simply enough. Just you can't get a mortgage for certain assets or houses, because you can't get insurance. So in parts of Australia, a single home is costing, the insurance of it is costing $250,000 to $300,000 a year. The insurance, which is net replacement costs. So what you start to see is this effect that's starting to happen is at the economic level, at the energy level, at the material level, at the food systems level, all driven by this reality. At the same time, as we start to see geopolitical constraints start to move in, which we are seeing, what we're seeing is effectively the re-geopoliticization of our markets. So markets are becoming subordinate to geopolitical interests as security and resilience becomes a key driver of economic or financial allocation rather than efficiency of capital. So we're moving from the efficiency of capital to security and resilience. So we're rebirthing what I would say is the security machine pretty much at a multipolar level around the world. And by implication, what that will do is we'll drive greater resilience, but we'll also drive a rapid increase in capacity, residual capacity, but we'll also be allocating more budgets to mechanisms of war, which is again larger hydrocarbon infrastructure. So what we've got is this runaway effect that we're in the middle of that's actually starting to escalate. And war economies are, unfortunately, in terms of GDP effect, quite addictive. So once you fall into a war economy addiction model, it's very difficult to get out of it because of the GDP implications it drives. And resetting that is quite a challenge. So we're in this very interesting move between the breakdown of commodity effects, the risk to our main foundational economies, and what that's doing to national economic behaviors. And that cycle, I think, is what we're in the middle of. And that, I think, is a very, very dangerous moment. And then to finally close on your political point, I would say, is that this is also setting up the politics that we're starting to see, the politics of quasi-nationalism or divisionality. And they're largely delusions, right? So the reality is we're not going to build, UK is not going to become a massive microchip manufacturer like in Taiwan. We're not going to do that. So what we've got is the delusion of a localism that is slightly ignorant of actually how globally entangled our global supply chains are in whether it's material sources. I think Ed Conway gives a beautiful example of, there's one factory in Birmingham that produces 50% of the diodes around the world for cars, which dim the mirror of your rear view mirror, and 50%. So what you've got is this global entanglement that I think is sort of measurable in analog mechanisms or understandable or mappable. And what we've got is this delusion of politics starting to emerge, which is a problem solution at the hyper-local level when this requires a different type of move. So I just wanted to sort of circle that arc, because I think it's important to see this as an arc rather than division.
Yeah, so definitely entanglement as the way as you've just expressed. And when you talk about breakdown, it's not really just breakdown of the natural and environmental systems. It's the domino effect in a sense. It's the breakdown of all of the other systems you've just mentioned, unpredictability leading to breakdown of insurance systems and potentially the financial markets. So we've already kind of in your first reply covered some of the political, economic, and other aspects. And I wanted to just pick up on, well, the three that we haven't mentioned so much in what we've just said, I mean, by implication, I think people can see the link, but just talk maybe about the legal, technical, and social, starting perhaps with the legal, if we could, and because I want to make a specific point about the social.
Well, I mean, there's so many different directions I can go into, and I'd like to spend more time when we talk about the solution landscape, why I think the legal domain is important. I think the one aspect that I think is really clear, and I think this is much more of a systemic issue, that I mean, again, I reference Katrina Pistoire's book, Coding of Capital, and how we've coded our world, legally coded our world, is perhaps one of the core sources of the systemic breakdown we're seeing. And we have coded our world on theories of divisibility. We've coded our world so property is focused on the theory of boundary. We've coded our world on the right to abuse and use and its sort of extrinsic power. And we've coded our world on the basis of optimizing for single point signals, profit as a signal system, as opposed to recognizing the multiple externalities and interdependencies in the system. So we've coded a legal infrastructure, which I think codes a worldview that is actually driving the crisis that we're seeing. So I think the legal infrastructure for me is rooted in the manifestation of a worldview, a manifestation of how we imagine ourselves and our relationship with the planet. And what we've done is created these institutional landscapes and these frameworks of our legal infrastructure, which are driving that externalization. And also what I'd say is that we need to be more nuanced, and I would like to separate legal frameworks and justice. Legality and justice are not the same thing. And often we start to confuse the two. Just legality and the legal framework is the equitability within the framework that exists, the norms that exist, the comprehensions. Justice is the expansion of the legal framework to acknowledge the externalizations and extractions that are currently not recognized in the system. And this tension between the legal and justice frameworks is really critical, because largely our legal infrastructure and our democratic infrastructure has been externalizing both in time and extracting in time, and it's been extracting in space, because that's what it's optimized for. And that, I think, is probably one of the root issues that I think sits. And that's all manifested in how we imagine ourselves and all the sort of theories of sovereignty and roots back into history, root theories of dominion. But that's where I do think the legal infrastructure conversation sits in a very particular worldview. And I think it needs to be part of a deeper conversation.
Well, I guess it also relates to the economic question, really, as well, and in terms of, what do we value, and then what are our values? How do we behave in virtuous ways related to those values, and how does the law support or undermine those processes, basically? So, in a sense, if we, as you suggested, think about redefining what we mean by value, that would have implications for thinking about how do we redefine the law as well.
Absolutely. I think sometimes the word value can be abstract. I mean, just to sort of concretize it, and I know I've done this in other conversations, the difference between a sustainable, viable apple grown in soil which is systemically regenerative, looked after, versus a can of cola. And I use those examples. A can of cola extracts, does ecological harm, does health harm, damages water systems, XYZ. Yeah, it might cost a pound. The apple might also cost a pound, but it's systemically regenerative to all parties in the system. So The pound of the apple is probably worth £5 to £10 of value created. The pound of the cola is probably worth minus £10 because it actually consumes and destroys value. And the problem is that we're currently unit pricing them at the same level. And that's a fundamental failure of the incentives and the mechanisms that we've built, that we've misunderstood. Not value as in like, am I a good guy, you a bad guy, or am I a bad guy, you. I think I'm just talking about the accounting problem here. And in a sense, and I think this is quite important because we've created an economy optimized for the can of cola, as opposed to the economy constructed for the can of and the apple. And the other thing I want to sort of also do is that it's really, people often talk about, well, it's free choice and markets, and yet we also know that actually humans don't compute every choice. That's not how we operate. You don't walk around the aisle going, let me do a full carbon calculation and a full nutrient calculation of what I want. If this was the case, marketing would be totally different. Marketing recognizes that's not how humans make choices. So we have a sort of a delusion between what I would call the politics of markets, as in choice mechanisms, and the operationalization of consumption, which is largely driven by mimesis and addiction systems, I would argue. And so what we've got is a theory and a delusion on the other side. And what that's doing is we've become addicted to the unit price of cola as opposed to the apple. And so this is not just a problem of accounting, it's also a problem of how our theories of markets are manifesting into that reality.
I think, at the heart of it, we need to have much more discussion about what do we mean by value, because otherwise we just default to monetary theory of value. Mariana Mazzucato, in her book, The Value of Everything, challenged economists to come up with new theories of value. She didn't offer one herself in the book, and I haven't seen any economists come up with anything new in terms of theories of value yet. But it did trigger me to start to really think about what do we value. And I've been trying to develop a concept which I call the dignity theory of value, which looks at the inherent worth of the things that are affected by the decisions that we might make. So that it won't replace the monetary theory of value, but it could help us add another dimension when we're making decisions, so that we might consider, is the inherent worth of the person, the other beings, the planet, or future generations positively or negatively impacted by the decision we're about to make? And then we may make some smarter decisions, is my guess. But I think a lot more work needs to be done on coming up with new theories of value and inherent value. I think when we're talking about nature and natural systems, is really what we need to focus on. And if the law understood inherent value, and I think it is starting to do, I think we'll maybe reference the example of the rivers be given legal status. That's an example of these things coming together, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd say is that, just building on what you're saying, is that I think there's an important conversation about discounting how we discount the future or how we value the future. So I think there is a really important conversation, like often we talk about the future of GDP as a sort of that, which is what I would say is a measurement of a form of value formation. If you were to talk about UK's 5, 10, 20, 50-year horizon of GDP, if you didn't just talk about present GDP, but GDP futures you would start to internalize many of the risks that are being currently externalized. So time is a very good friend.
Yeah.
And we've alienated time to presentism. So time is a very powerful forcing function to force us to internalize certain things that we're currently discounting to near zero. because capital does that in the way it operates. So I think there's often we look for different metrics, but I also think the movement of time will do many of those things. And I think what I find interesting is the landscape of security and resilience is all rooted in not the optimization of capital, but the continuity of provision. And what we're going to see is time becomes your key function in security theory and resilience. So we're seeing a new economics being born between, and by security, I don't mean kinetic security. I mean energy, water, minerals,
Food,
food, nutrients. I mean system level securities and how they become critical in a kind of birth of a new economic confluence between security and economics. And I think this is going to be one of the defining forces as we move into a new transition landscape.
Oh, and we kind of come back to the accounting problem then, because obviously accounting is accounting for a certain kind of value, not the kind of value that we should be accounting for. And although I think accounting is kind of appreciating the problem exists, and is looking for answers, at the moment, accounting hasn't really come up with the right kind of answers, has it?
No, but I think the weak signals I'm looking at was, so forgive me, this is sort of slightly honest conversation. When everyone was looking at Russia and saying, well, Russia's got the economy the size of Spain. So what are we talking about here? And what you realize is there's quite a difference between the measurement of GDP and the capacity for resilience and the capacity for kinetic war and supply chains of kinetic defense. These cracks are becoming visible, not in the kind of landscape of activism, but in the landscape of hard national security issues landscapes.
Yeah, and I think if accountants would understand this in terms of the balance sheet is a measure of performance at a point in time, and GDP is effectively the balance sheet at a point in time. What you're arguing is that we should be looking at that over various different timescales in order to start to rethink our decisions. So I think that's pretty interesting. We've covered here pretty much the political, economic, legal, environmental in our discussions so far.
Would you mind if we just do a little bit on political?
Yes, sure.
One landscape so one of my greatest concerns here is what I'd call the delusion of being able to solve the problem in the local. And this is not a disagreement that we need to circularize our material chains. We need to make our material chains more biomaterially driven. It's not an argument against that. It's just an argument that even if we do that, we're reliant on global supply chains. So once we've done that, we have an entanglement at critical minerals and other levels that is still planetary. And what we need to be very careful of is constructing a politics and an idea of survivability in isolation. So security will not be delivered to the UK through a red line boundary. So we draw a red line boundary around the UK, we don't become more secure, we become more fragile. We are going to have to take a systems view of security, and we're going to recognize our planetary entanglements. So, for example, if we lost one of the major ice sheets in Greenland, well, the UK probably uses 90% of its total wealth. 90%. That's sort of, I mean, magnitude. I've not done a calculation, but I've looked at the sea level rise implications. Yeah. So what you start to realize is that we are systemically entangled into planetary assets and impacts. And I can talk about supply chains and other things. But why this is important is this is not an argument for aid or anything like that. I'm not making that argument. I can make that argument. What I'm making an argument for is enlightened self-interest through a systems lens. And we have to construct the politics for enlightened self-interest from a systems lens. And this can be at the material level, at the ecological level, and also at the human level, because if we set up enough trauma in the world, because of the nature of the population base and the information base of the UK, those traumas will self-invest inside us. So actually, this is an argument for a new theory of politics through a systems lens and a new political discourse that isn't rooted in divisionality. My current worry is that we're trying to fall back to an idea of defensibility, which is an old idea of defensibility, and we haven't adopted a systems view and an entangled view of risks.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. I'm glad you picked up on that point, because it's one that really stood out to me from your previous interviews, because a lot of people that would agree with pretty much everything you're saying would defend the idea of localism as a solution. It seems to me that's kind of driven to a large extent by this desire for securitization of my local community, and it's another delusion. It seems that seems to be what you're saying.
And I
Because of
appreciate
this,
its intent, right? It's nothing wrong with the intent.
mm,
But what I think is the means to do it is going to require us to be a much more enlightened self-interest perspective, which is going to require us to be bigger, not smaller, which I think
yeah,
is a really interesting invitation for our own sense of how we actually have to resolve this problem.
yeah, good intentions are never enough, are they? I don't guess it's born partly out of fear and a desire to feel in control as well. I mean, the human traits, and we see people taking shortcuts and making bad decisions out of driven by those kinds of emotions very frequently in other areas as well, not just in
And
this
and and
particular
and,
case.
uh, and I think there's something really important here, which I don't often think is discussed, is what I would say is the psychogeography of volatility, the psychogeography of economic unraveling, which I think is fair. And what is the construction of politics in this niche psychogeography? And I think what we're seeing is not only a psychogeography of fair, but we're also seeing the effect of that, which is a psychogeography of control as a reaction to fear. And and what we're creating is political narratives rooted in those psychogeographies. Unfortunately, control is not going to be sufficient to deal with complexity. Unfortunately, we're going to have to find courage, not just fear. And there are other dimensions going to be critical to deal with this. And why I say this, especially from a population base that is, you know, demographically getting more aged, more psychologically vulnerable. There's there's a risk of what I would call the systemic psychogeographies of and what they invite us to. So how do we build a pathway to not resort, and especially when information is complex, uh, structurally misinformed sometimes, intentionally misinformed, weaponized? How do we build a landscape of courage? How do we build a landscape to actually be bigger, not smaller? How do we build a landscape of actually being able to recognize the invitation for a generation to be extraordinary? I think this is a really important problem. And we have to construct also the governance of what is a politics of fair and what is a politics of this of control. And control as a theory will not work in a complex entangled supply chain when actually if the Amazon dies, we're all dead.
Because some of those emotions are really based on our primitive instincts. Certain politicians in particular find it very easy as a tactic to play on those fears rather than to encourage courage. Therefore, it is a big challenge to figure out how do we develop a more positive, constructive politics that actually encourages, um, the constructive approaches, the positive attitudes, and so on. And I go back to looking at the first Enlightenment. It was flawed in many ways. It was very positive in other ways. But one thing that was really characteristic of it in relation to what we've just been saying is the fact that it was the spirit of the age. Was curiosity, it was pioneering, it was looking for solutions. It was, you could argue, a lot more courageous as a spirit. And in that sense, if it was positively directed, I think we need to kind of redefine the spirit of the age going forward. At the moment, we seem to be in a kind of doom loop, driven by fear, and we need to reverse that somehow. One other aspect that we've not talked about so far from a sort of problems perspective is the part that new technology, and plays into this as part of the pastel system. Could you talk about technology and how that's the way it's being kind of managed and developed at the moment, perhaps not really helping us?
Yeah, so there's two dimensions I'd like to bring in on this. One, I think technology as we've currently building it and scaling it is largely a tool of capital and control. And it's largely rooted in theories of 19th century theories of orchestration and construction. So our technologies are built and scaled in frameworks of 19th century institutions.
Industrial era thinking,
Precisely.
which also
So,
links to industrial era legal frameworks, accounting
precisely.
frameworks, and so on. Yeah.
Exactly. So a limited liability company is still the framework in which how we hold technology. Our theories of, and even our theory of market, I would argue, doesn't recognize what I would say is the near network level power of these technologies. So they have network effects, which are quasi-monopolistic. So we're operating in a new theory, and I don't think we even have the means to orchestrate. We're still trying to regulate these institutions of these new economies through a theory of markets, when actually they've broken the theory of markets into a new theory of dominant quasi, even if ephemeral monopolies, I would argue. They are monopolies for a period. With great forcing function. I think one of the big things I would say is the nature of, people often talk about the technology itself. I think what we should, as you rightly point out, is look at the institutional frames that are scaling and enhancing our technologies. Then slightly deeper in, I would say the other part of the challenge is that most of our technology is rooted in theories of management. And I think that's also just a really important model. And management, I would argue, most of our logics of management have come out of logics of control, dominion, and instructionism. So our theory of orchestration has been built largely from military logic. So much of our logics of managerialism have come through military and logistics infrastructures, and they're all rooted in theories of control, predictability, in instructability into systems. And that means that our technologies have been born into this, and I'm going to use slightly emotive language, but quasi-enslaved futures, dominion futures. And what I find fascinating is that those two frames construct and the extrapolation space of technology. How technology is, firstly, what technology do we hunt for? What is the thesis of technology? And then what technology is scaled? And so a good example would be that what would machine learning capabilities look like if they were desired to ennoble humans, and what would their frame look like? So there's been some really great experiments done of, for example, if you make judges aware that they're more likely to give difficult and challenging sentences just before lunch than they are at the first session, making people self-aware of their blood sugars and their effects on how they're making decisions, they tend to make better decisions. So here, technology is being used as an ennobling device to help us come over our own biases and invite us to be our better selves. Now, you could also use technology to automate decisions on the basis of what judges have been doing and to say, right, we're going to streamline those decisions to be able to actually make it more efficient decisions based on retrospective extrapolation. Now, there are that's a different thesis of technology and what its role is into that landscape. And I use that just as an illustrative example of how we're starting to build and extrapolate the future. Is it an extrapolation of the machine instructable landscape, or is it an expansion of our thesis? And one of the big domain challenges we're facing is a shift between what I would say is the control, power over, and instructable economy and the care economy. The deep fissure we're facing is that. And the control, dominion, control economy is rooted in theories of predictability, instructability, quasi-enslavement. And I use enslavement because I want people to understand that our current theory of labor is an instructable, microized theory of enslavement, where you allocate your part of your humanity to the instructional ability of humans. Now that landscape is one particular way of orchestrating value. There's another way, which is actually to build agency, care, learning capacity. When you do that, you actually have discovery capacity in systems, which is rooted in operating in complexity, operating in non-predictability. These are 21st century economies of craft. But they require a different theory of technology at the back end of them, because actually to operate in care requires you to operate from decentralized distributed agency. It requires you to operate with theories of not only recognizing your needs, but the needs of your counterparty and the universal capacities. So the cognition of care is different, as well as actually the theory of reflective learning, learning development, oriented coherence. So what I want to do is a little bit look back into technology and the logics that are constructing our technological fields. And often we get critiqued on what I would call the applications of technology rather than the structures and the conceptual frames and the field spaces we're opening up. And one of the things I wanted to just largely end with is on this particular point is that one of my shocking experiences was I went to one of the best universities in the world. And I realized that in conversation there, this was about 6-7 years ago, most of their funding came from corporations, very well funded through corporations. And I realized that they were blinded to world possibilities. So we were talking at that time, this was 6-7 years ago, about the role of universal basic income. And they were like, why would you do that? Why would you? They could not perceive the air outside the water that they were used to. Like if there were fish in the sea that couldn't perceive the air, because the economic modality, they'd become self-constraining. It was they had constrained their own imagination in recognition of the system that was around them. And so I think we're constraining our landscapes of technology with regards to the socio-technological system that we've constructed around it, which is no longer paradigmatically appropriate to the context and situation we find ourselves.
So 2 points from what you've just been saying. I think that one relating to power. I think actually power and our understanding of it is one of the other really huge delusions. And it's one that I usually reference Mary Parker Follett writing in the early 1900s, talking about power with rather than power over. So on the point about technology, then, a very interesting, useful piece of work that's been done in relation to that is around values sensitive design. Later, they changed it to value sensitive design as opposed to values. Personally, I think they should have kept it to the former. But there's a book with that title that they published through MIT. And I think a lot more work needs to be done in that area so that we think about technology, not just in the narrow sense of, IT and usual types of technology, but technology in the broader sense of every kind of systems are technologies. So if we
Good.
design all of our systems based on a sort of understanding of values as part of that process, I think that could help try and solve many of the problems that we've just been describing as well.
Yeah, totally. Very much agree.
Okay, so let me come on to the area that we've not covered yet, and I've deliberately left till the last of the pastel issues, not because it's not important, actually, it's extremely important, and that's the social. Um, everybody seems to be worried about and focused about on the environmental and natural resources sustainability issues for very good reasons. But you suggest that we're going to hit social tipping points first. Can you explain why and the implications of that, maybe?
Well, I mean, I would argue we're in the process of social tipping points already, which is not only, yes, of course, the rise of a multipolar world, but also the shifting of vast amounts of resources at a planetary scale to war footings and kinetic war investments. And I think this is part of actually starting to recognize an old economy that is becoming systemically not abundant, but constrained, and a critical fight, an existential fight for positions, whether it's on future technologies like machine learning and radical features of machine learning, but also critical resources. So we're seeing whether it's the constraints of dominant positions in technology or dominant positions over resources starting to create a sort of geopoliticization of our global economy. Now that is a fractal problem. That's not just between nation states, it's also within nation states. And I think, and when you compound that with what I would say are tipping point accelerators, a climate event, a food crisis, what you see is destabilization risk. And we're starting to see that across the world in, 60 nations around the world are now in the red list in terms of actually stability risks. So we're seeing a growth in social instability, our ability to use control and traditional models of nation state control theory breaking down in an effective means of organizing. So I would argue that we're reaching many of these tipping points and the social dynamics are already being reconfigured. And I think that is and like I sort of say, the kind of language I said right at the beginning of, uh, the landscape of Earth being sufficient for 1 billion people, the political narratives that we construct in the face of these constraints are also laying the pathways for war in many formats and extermination. So I think really worry that yes, climate tipping points are happening, but what we're seeing is these social dynamics at a macro and a micro level starting to become much more systemic. And we're starting to see that, I think, whether it's, and we're, if you look at ages of humans, sort of life expectancy in Europe and US starting to fall away, you're seeing all of these micro violences now starting to impinge on the reality. So when I talk about these social violences, I sort of talk about how all these gains that we had got start to be unwound. So the macro violences are all starting to impinge at a systemic level, and they open up spaces of systemic instability at a social level, which I think is already starting to happen around the world. Like I said, 60 countries being on the red list. So I think there's a dynamic there it's not as well talked about and discussed, which I think is going to be very critical.
Well, even at the level of a community, when we look at housing shortage, for example, and
Yeah,
then that's going to start to produce intergenerational conflict potentially as well. So
totally.
we can't obviously go into detail about all of these issues, but I can see exactly where you're coming from. So, looking at each of the pastel issues, each one of them is a very large, complex, complicated, entangled system. I'm going to ask you a question now, which is, I've previously talked about our insufficient systems thinking capabilities as individuals and as organizations. I usually describe it as our systems thinking capabilities gaps. And I wonder if you agree that we're kind of deluding ourselves that we've got the systems thinking capabilities to be able to understand these issues at this level that we need to, and the level of entanglement that exists between them makes that problem, well, really extremely dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, as an outcome, I totally agree with you. In particular, I would say I think the challenge is even more challenge exists at higher resolution levels, deeper in. So I think it's not just system thinking. If I'm rooted in a theory of understanding myself as an individual, as a bounded model, not myself as a system, then what I have is a mirrored model of thinking into the world. So I may understand a system map, but if the psychology of myself is not being transformed to understand myself in interrelationship, what you find is there's weakness. And then I think if you operate in theories of property and dominion, you then actually do not understand the world through systems, but you understand the world through objects. And so what we've got is an object-oriented worldview that's coded into the fundamentals of our economy, property theory. Then what you've got is classification theory, which is then, again, takes that object-oriented point of view and orientates the world not through relationality, but through separation and divisibility. So what we've got is a systemic problem which goes all the way through, and it manifests all the way up through to our university infrastructure, which is orientated around disciplinarity, when we know actually in moments of volatility, it is the intersections of disciplines that produce the greatest value. So what you've got is a knowledge development institution, which are entirely built on actually divisibility. So, and that's really problematic because we know in the 1970s, if you looked at all the brilliant, whether it's mathematicians, they were writing stuff in physics and vice versa. You had this hybridities of polymathic capabilities that were a key part. And what we've now done is accelerated divisibility. So all I want to say is that I think, yes, system thinking capability, but it's rooted in these deep structures of transformation. And I think we need to recognize that this is a symbiotic relationship. So yes, we have to transform ourselves. We have to transform our institutions around us. As sort of unfortunately, Winston Churchill said, we create the environments and the environment creates us. I think we're very much like that. We create our institutions and the institution create us. We have to unwind and rebuild that dynamic.
And what you've just said, now if we move towards looking at the solutions, I want to start looking at those from the personal perspective. So what you just said is a good lead into that. And I've heard you say previously that you think that in the past there have been major transitions in societies in points in history. Individuals and the human being has redefined what it means to be a human each time one of those major transitions has taken place. So you're suggesting that we need to do that again, and we need to think of ourselves not as human beings but human becomings, which is interesting because actually I registered the domain name for human becomings because I wanted to write a book on with that title. But what do you think we need to become as humans? How does humans need to rethink what it means to be human, given what we're facing in the future?
So I think the science of what it means to be human is already there, and the philosophy is already there. So whether it's recognizing that, um, you know, so like, for example, a child born in financial stress, um, systemically, constant financial stress in a household with financial stress will effectively, even if you give them the same level of nutrients, will not absorb those nutrients. So it's not just it's the stress of the household, which actually has bodily level effects in terms of absorption capacity and the developmental capacity of that child. So we know whether it's epigenetics, we know whether it's in terms of your social networks, actually have massive impact on your cognitive development frameworks. We know that we are biologically, we're a multitude. So actually we're a multitude of organisms, not most of it is not human DNA. We also know that that you know, we are even in spectrum of, we exist off a spectrum of personalities. We've created a singularity of personality as an idea. The brain is a social brain. It's distributed. Our sort of cognitive function is not just a function of in our head. It's a distributed agent. We've used memory systems, institutional frameworks to compound our thinking frameworks. The reality of this is understood. What we have is and I use the word political as in a social political negotiation, a conceit that lives from an old world.
Yeah.
So the science and the realization is already there. We just haven't found a new politic of being radically human. And in that, there's a deep politic, which is also about the transformation of human as units of labor to a new theory of post-labor, which actually, if you were to recognize the sovereignty and expand, it's a paper that we're writing on the explosion of sovereignties, which actually is not just this sovereignty of post-nation state sovereignty or the individual sovereign, but also the kind of multitudes of sovereignties that exist within us and the kind of embodiment of that. So what we have is the science and the politics of this is there, but this also challenges theories of control, challenges theories of power over, as you were rightly saying. But that means that we have to become embodied intelligences in craft and dialogue and learning, coherence becoming a function of reflective learning capacities and developmental capacities rather than actually control instructable capacities. So this is a symbiotic transformation of both and an emancipation, I would argue, not just a transformation. It's emancipation of being radically human again. And that is, I think, the real transformation that's available to us, is the reduction of humans as from bad robots and choice of robots to actually deeply human. And that choice manifests itself in being able to be in care, manifesting a reimagination of ourselves, rooted in learning and development orientated, as opposed to control theory. So this is a massive, it's as transformative as I think the Industrial Revolution transformed the human psyche, at least, into one of being a bad machine. We mimicked ourselves as machines. I think this is as great a transformation as that when we reimagine what it means to be human in radically new ways.
Well, I think that what you're saying is, all that knowledge exists, but it's not widely known. We need to sort of increase levels of consciousness and understanding of those things much more generally if they're going to start to have impact on the way.
Yes, and I would say is that it's not just a sort of developmental theory for the sake of a developmental theory. This is also a developmental theory that unlocks a new theory of value.
Yeah.
And a theory of value that operates in complexity and discovery and operating in uncertainty. So it's also a fundamental socioeconomic transformation, not just a sort of what I'd call a moral one. So often these transformations are rooted in a theory of morality, not sufficiently in a theory of a new economic unfurling, which is where I also would like to position these two conversations as conjunct.
But ultimately, when the consciousness level is there, that results in a change of worldviews, a change of behaviors, and so on. But at the moment, partly there's a lack of general consciousness of what you've been describing. At the same time, we've talked already about fear, and it seems to me that to the average person, all of these issues are completely just daunting. The scale of the challenges. So there's a sense of which a lot of people, I think, feel like kind of rabbits in the headlights. And even those that are sort of more conscious are increasingly, well, are also daunted and maybe choose to be willfully blind.
I think through fear, yes, right? Um, there's a protectionism of an idea because this requires us to, I think Thomas Bjorkman said it quite beautifully. You have to let go of the certainty of the illusion of the past to embrace the unknown of a possible future. And that is a leap of courage. It's not a leap of, and I think the scaffolding, the knowledge exists, but, but there is there's an invitation in it of being extraordinary. And I think that is the invitation that's honestly at the back of the table. It's not, it's an invitation to be extraordinary, which I think is actually quite a compelling invitation. It's an invitation to rebuild a new thesis of what it means to be human, which I think is also a compelling conversation.
That really sort of comes back to the point I was making earlier about the need to sort of think about what's the spirit of the age that we need for going forward, and
Precisely.
restoring the courage, the pioneering, the curiosity, and actually seeing that as something positive, not something negative.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've kind of talked about all of these systemic issues, the fact that breakdown is happening, but you say that we've got a kind of choice. We can either sort of sit and watch the breakdown happening, or we can choose to work out how to break through. So I want to sort of move on in the conversation now to sort of explore some of the ways in which you think that we may be able to break through some of these issues as well.
Sure.
I mean, you suggested that everything's got to change. And so we need to see the world differently. We need kind of new theories of value, new values. We need new ways of accounting. We need different kinds of institutions. And we need to rethink our understanding of power and agency. This all amounts to a paradigm shift, it would seem, to use one of the cliched terms that is used perhaps too much these days. But I wonder if you agree that it represents the need for a new enlightenment, as I call it, or you may want to call it something different, but a fundamental shift of whatever name you want to give it.
No, totally. So yes, we are at a phase shift of civilization. And if I had to narrate a long arc, I really like James Lovelock's narration, where and this is an interpretation, not the truth, but I like how he situates the fact that the planet has been a battery. It has captured solar energy and stored it, and we've been using this energy to build a planetary scale consciousness. And that planetary scale consciousness is a machine human ecological consciousness of 8.5 billion people, how many other non-human systems, and that planet has now become self-aware through the use of that battery. And we have now achieved a sort of a first horizon planetary consciousness, i.e. we're aware of the damage we're able to do. And in that consciousness starting to auto-reflect, to start to repair, reconstitute the frameworks of damage. Now, if you look at it through that lens, you start to see quite an extraordinary moment that we have achieved. The Earth has used huge amounts of resources to achieve planetary consciousness, and is now starting to re-metamorphosize into a phase shift. And I would argue, this is again James Lovelock, and I really enjoy this long view because it sort of puts us outside this doom loop narrative, but actually puts an extraordinary proposition on the table. At the same time, operating in this new landscape challenges all sorts of deep orthodoxies of how we imagine ourselves as humans. Like education was fundamental to the Industrial Revolution, right? Educating people, making them predictable, making them instructable. Unit theories of labor was the expansion of enslavement in a full sense of the word. This was an economy rooted in a theory of ideology. All those things are now breaking apart. Property theory was rooted in that. So as we start to move into this new world, we also have to reimagine not only what it means to be human, what it means to organize material economies around the world, i.e. beyond property. And there's huge, we're doing some work, quite a lot of work around that, all the way through to where value actually exists. So for example, a tree canopy of a city has systemic value but isn't priceable. It's currently a liability on the balance sheet of a city. There isn't a balance sheet of a city. There's a balance sheet of a municipality, but there isn't even a balance sheet of the city itself. So what you start to realize is that there's new classes of value. So what is the collective, the value of the collective intelligence of a city? So there's new theories of where value exists. There's new conceptions of what it means for me to how I imagine ourselves, all the way up the chain to actually, I think, new practices of economies. And I think what we're seeing is the role of reagentifying the world. So, at the macro level, what we're seeing is the reanimism of the world, if you want to put it in a different lens, which is actually we're moving beyond property and dominion and control theory, where actually things become reanimated using machine capabilities, new forms of technological capabilities, which means that we can become into dialogic relationship, into a treaty relationship with the planet around us, as opposed to a dominion control relationship, which radically improves the optimization of and the efficacies of the world around us. That is a different worldview built on different theory of technology and also a different technological stack, as well as a new conception of actually how we move beyond property and control theory. This also means changing our nutrient frameworks. It also means moving towards a biomaterial economy, which means that we have to build a new biomaterial base, which requires us to transform our food systems and our diets in terms of being optimized towards vast amounts of meat consumption, which has huge amounts of damage ecologically. It also means we have to change our farming practices to be less orientated around extractionism, to systemic agroforestry and regenerative practices, which also means that we actually rejuvenate our soil systems. So what we're seeing is whether it's the human, our technological base, or bureaucratic base, our energy systems, our material systems, these foundations are being transformed. And they're being transformed in the wake of a birthing planetary consciousnesses and a capability for the re-agentification of the world at an extraordinary level. And I think that's a pretty extraordinary invitation that we're living in the middle of. And I think that dream or that possibility space is available to us because, surprisingly enough, we have the confluence of new capabilities and we have the confluence of new needs, and we have conceptions that can be manifest that couldn't be manifest before.
So you and I find that what you just said exciting. There's so many opportunities, but you used a phrase in what you just said several times: re-educating. So how do we manage to make that happen on a large scale? I mean, is it possible through traditional education systems, or do we need a different way of educating?
Well,
Because
yeah,
I
I mean,
imagine most
yeah.
teachers in schools, for example, wouldn't understand a lot of what we've been describing today necessarily, or it certainly wouldn't be on the curriculum for them to be able to teach.
Yeah, I mean, I would, yeah. So I would say education and learning are two different things.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to move from education, which is the instruction of information, I would say, to creating learning societies, to borrow a phrase, and building learning societies and creating the conditions for learning and self-authoring is probably one of the biggest transformations on the table. The unfortunate problem is that we are often right now, if you look at where money is being allocated to climate transitions, we're currently allocating to what I would call the material physical transitions at best. We're not doing a very good job at that. But we're certainly not allocating to the transformation of what it means to be human, which I think is a root theory in unlocking this landscape. So I think one of the biggest investments any major society is right now going to have to make is recognizing a new human machine biophysical reality. And what does it mean for the role of the human economy in the face of a new machine economy and new biophysical transformation? And that interface is, I think, really one of the most extraordinary 1 in a 500-year transformation of the developmental capacity of being human. And I don't think we're allocating anywhere near enough imagination, not money, imagination into what it means. And I think history shows that whether it's 1813 when Denmark went bankrupt and it rebuilt itself in 1813 went back in 1815, it sort of came out, it invested in education environments. The Volk schools, as Thomas Bjorkman has often talked about in Sweden, which were building our self-authoring capacity. So they're new practices of actually re-ennobling us, building learning societies that are fundamental into making this transition.
And do you think that example that you've just described, the work being done by Thomas, and also maybe the work he's doing in the development goals with the United Nations related to the Sustainable Development Goals, do you see that as a sort of some of the pathways in which we, in practical terms, go about achieving what you've just been describing, about helping people learn what it means to become a human?
I think they're such an important part. And I think this is also about not just that, it's also about the structural transformation of corporations not being orientated around control, but orientated around learning. That's why I talk about learning societies. It's also about how we construct our environments to be rooted in theory of developmental and learning as opposed to control and instruction orientation. It's also about reimagining our schooling infrastructures. It's reimagining our project-based learning. All these things have been growing, but actually we're sort of talking about a much deeper exploration of what it means to be human and relationships with technology. So yes, and it's a 10x multiplier of that reality. And I think we're not yet, there was a time when everyone talks about the new information economy, and there was a whole buzz in the UK and, Tony Blair era. There was a whole thing about we were reimagining schooling in this new age. Don't think we understand we are now in a 10x future of that reality, of those discussions. We're now living in that future, and we aren't really systemically thinking about what it means to do that. And at the same time, I would say that if, as neuroscientists and other people that, many of you know, actually our knowledge base to do this work is far stronger than it's ever been. We just aren't deploying it.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking then as well, that, it seems to take a crisis to bring about the willingness to reimagine. Well, we've had a few of those, and I guess it's maybe why there seems to be more people willing to reimagine these days as well. But then it seems that, when economies start to pick up and living standards start to improve, and you're going through a good time, those kind of initiatives start to tail off, drift, and people kind of lose interest in them. I mean, there was almost a movement called, the organizational learning movement, which was developed by Peter Senge. So what was that, in the 1970s, 80s onwards? Which seems to have fizzled out to be not very talked about. Maybe we need to re-establish organizational learning as a concept. Maybe organizations need to be much better at learning and reimagining in the future, and maybe we should extend that to societal learning that you're describing.
Absolutely. I, you know, I think you're absolutely right. We were aware of this problem in the 70s, right? So we knew this crisis was coming, yet what we had was the capacity to accelerate hydrocarbon, mineral consumption, and other things, and that capability to exhaust masked our capacity to deal with crisis. So you're right, we've been thinking about this stuff, and maybe this is a 50-year grace period where all these thinking had to be done in order to come to this moment. But I also think that this is a slightly different moment. I don't see a pathway for a return to an old-fashioned material abundance and extractionism getting us through this reality. So this is one of those pivotal moments, and societies which are able to embrace those pivots are going to find not only they're going to find new theories of value, but also new theories of value creation and new emancipation and new theories of freedom. And I think there's a massive opportunity at the end of that, which deals with the kind of the systemic residues that we're living in of an old control world.
And it seems that we need to be reimagining and so on all of these systems all at the
Yeah,
same time in a synchronized kind of way.
precisely.
So can I, as we sort of come towards the end of the interview, I wonder if I can ask you to just maybe give some thoughts on some really very, very practical, well, advice, I guess. If you were a politician, where should you begin to respond to what you've heard today if you've listened to this interview?
As a politician, I think the first order horizon, I would say, is what I'm looking for is simple competence first. Embrace the numbers, embrace the problem space. Don't run away from it. Don't give it political, like embrace the numbers as we're starting to see them and start to look at strategically managing the risk associated to numbers. First horizon is that. Like that's really the first responsibility. I worry that we are looking at the world largely from a political conceit as opposed to the kind of pragmatics of looking at what the numbers are telling us. Second thing is, I think operating from a political level, I think it's really vital we start to recognize this psychogeographies that we're operating in, and how do we scaffold and build, as you said, a sort of a shift those psychogeographies is going to be a key part of making those transformations, the tone of a civilization. I think that's a really key thesis. Third, I think I would start to look at the institutional reform. The logics coded in our institutions are entrapping us to an old framework, and actually being able to reimagine where we see value and how we construct value is going to be key. Fifth, I would almost certainly allocate to what does human-machine ecological learning frameworks look like? How do you build advanced learning societies of the 21st century? It's going to be one of the key moves. Any society that's able to do that will be unlocking value that's not being talked about in different formats. Next, I'd be talking about actually fundamentally taking a systems view on security and how do you operationalize in a world through a systems lens and a security lens, and how do you construct new economic narratives and an idea of economic management at the centerpiece between security and economy, recognizing the entanglements. And that, I think, opens up a massive systemic pathway for transformation. And then finally, and the underlying project, I think, is about the reimagination of being human. And that, to me, is the big cultural project that I think is the back end of the story. And I think this is where I think deep explorations at the cultural level of what it means to be 21st century human and building the cultural frameworks for that. And I don't mean culture as in elite cultural institutions. I mean expanding and re-envisioning that, I think, is really vital. And finally, perhaps rooted in that, I think, is a new thesis on freedom. If I was a politician, my thesis would be a new theory of freedom, rooted not in the freedom of choices constructed by markets, but of freedom to be radically human, recognizing the systemic enslavement and the entrapment we've done or constructed in society. And I think that psychologically opens up a very powerful landscape for transformation. So that would be my manifesto if I was advising a politician.
Oh, that's a pretty excellent start, I would suggest. And I think that just based on interviews I've seen you done before, I think there are maybe a couple of other bits that I would suggest that. So you said before that the kind of changes and developments we need can't be driven centrally. So it's about thinking about or rethinking
Yeah,
agency again, like it kind of relates to power with rather than power over as well. So it's decentralizing the
totally,
solution space, yeah.
totally.
Um, okay, so can I ask you the same question then, in terms of if you were a business leader, or say leader of a policy think tank, perhaps, leader of some kind of uh, in, able to influence and bring about change, what would you, with the sort of top recommendations for, in practical terms, a business leader, leaders or directors maybe listening to this?
So my number one theory would be that we're going to have to move from control theory as a means to discover value to learning theory, so organizational learning. The future CEO will be a chief learning officer. And actually rooting an organization through a theory of coherence through learning, I think is going to be fundamental to be able to operate in complexity. I think the theory of value, like I spoke earlier about the can of cola versus a can of sustainable apple, where does value lie at the system scale, and how do you operationalize system scale value? I think is going to be fundamental to the operation of enterprises in the 21st century. I think how we construct that value chain is also going to be, if we're operating in systems and system liabilities, how do you price in the value of resilience into systems? What are the economics of resilience in those frameworks is going to be a vital part of those frameworks. And I think so not only are we going to be talking about new assets, new value creation, but actually new ways of operating towards those values. And fundamentally also there's radical new financing mechanisms that are going to be required to be able to unlock those futures. And I think this requires us to start to think more systemically about our financing tools, instruments that are going to be available to us to be able to unlock those futures. And there's a lot of work that we're doing around those things that becomes vital. So I think those would be the kind of key points that I'd make to sort of 21st century business leaders. This is almost a systemic revolution of the nature of value formation, as the Industrial Revolution was about the commodity in isolation and unification of value. This is about something else. And being able to do that is going to require new capabilities.
Okay, so a couple of more questions along the same kind of lines really are related to what should accountants take away from this in terms of what they should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, sort of again, going back to what I was saying, that I think two key dimensions certainly reflecting out of this story. How do you account for the apple versus the cola? What's the accounting theory? How do you account for and organize the tree canopy of a city? Where does the value lie relative to the liability owners and the beneficiaries? How do we construct the value? And these are real accounting problems. How do we start to think about futures of GDP and the risk to future of GDP? How do we actually convert value at risk as not just a financial instrument for financial markets, but actually value at risk into the real world landscapes? And what does that start to mean? I think we have to start to become more precise. Like a piece of a house is three theories of value. I would argue the land itself, the physical, biological capacities of the land, the material economy of the house itself and the kind of chain of that, the utility function of housing, and then what I would say is the house is also equity position into its city. It's an equity buy. And most of the value we've seen in housing inflation is the equity in the city itself, which has been inflating. So actually being able to unbundle value and restructure it fit for the 21st century is going to be able to be key parts of constructing not only new material economies, but new theories of land economies, but also new theories of stewardship, and also new theories of option sort of value orchestration and entangled formats, as opposed to the enclosure of all these things into the theories of land. And that's going to be made possible by new technological capacities.
And I think those comments relate to what value from this conversation as investors and economists might take away. But are there any specific additional comments you would want to make to investors or economists?
I think the number one thing for me from an economist perspective is that we let financial economy dictate vast amounts of our thesis on economy. A polycapital approach is going to be vital. Most of our financial economy resides on risk and risk management and capacities to insure, which means that the risk of our financial economy is rooted to incumbents and power. What does that really mean when we start to take a justice perspective? So polycapital approaches, recognizing most of our real world economy is rooted in ecological and care economies. How do we value that? How do we understand their entanglements and systemic viabilities into that framework? I think these are going to be the profound questions of the 21st century. And then I do think the theory of security and resilience in a kind of new economic thesis is going to be one of the most systemic transformers.
Well, I hope in the future we'll be able to sort of bring these various different audiences together to try and explore some of these issues, because I don't think they should be trying to explore them separately, but in a more joined up kind of way would make a lot more sense. We're doing a live session together, so hopefully people joining the live session in September, October, when we do that, will have seen this recording in advance and will have been able to sort of prepare some thoughts or further questions. That should be a good dialogue, and hopefully we get a number of representatives of the various different audiences I've just mentioned into that discussion with us. So I thank you very much for the conversation today. I don't know if there's anything you want to say as a sort of final word, but that's been fantastic from my point of view. Thanks very much.
No, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for the time and effort that you're putting into this. These are important conversations. And one thing I'd say is I do want to preface everything as this is my best available understanding. I invite critique and landscapes for improvement from everyone listening.
I should have said actually also, although all of this sounds quite daunting and so on, you do come across as being actually optimistic.
Very much so. I think this is an extraordinary moment.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, my friend.
Cheers.